Attenborough. I like spiders. Do you like spiders too?
We both want to wish the Lionesses the best of luck for tonight. You've done amazingly well in the competition and we're rooting for you all the way.
Good luck. I hope you win. Bye.
7 words. That's all it took to send tremors through the walls of Kensington Palace. 7 small words from the lips of a child, yet they carried the weight of generations. I can't keep this secret any longer. When Princess Charlotte whispered to them, it wasn't out of frustration, and it wasn't a cry for attention. It was something far more serious, a breaking point, a private moment that forced the future king and queen to stop everything and look into the eyes of their daughter and finally hear what she had been carrying all along. For months, Charlotte had watched in silence, noticing things that no one realized she was seeing. She had tucked away every offhand comment, every cold glance, every uncomfortable silence. But children see more than we think, and this particular child, poised, intelligent, and deeply intuitive, had seen too much. She had reached her limit. This wasn't just a moment of emotion, it was a reckoning, and what she revealed would rattle not just her parents, but the entire royal household. So what was the secret that drove a 10-year-old royal to the edge? What truth had been buried for so long, only to erupt in a quiet confession that would change everything? Stay with us, because what Princess Charlotte finally said could reshape the royal family's future. A princess under pressure. From the outside, she's just a young girl in a polished dress, waving politely beside her family at royal events. But Princess Charlotte's world is anything but ordinary. Born into one of the most watched families on the planet, her every move is analyzed, her expressions decoded, her body language scrutinized by millions. But unlike her brothers, George and Louis, there's something different about Charlotte, something deeper. She doesn't just smile for the cameras, she watches, she listens, she absorbs, and lately, what she's been absorbing has grown heavier by the day. As the only daughter of the future king and queen, Charlotte stands at a unique intersection of tradition, pressure, and personal identity. She's expected to carry herself with poise, maturity, and discretion well beyond her years. But behind the princess's persona lies a child still navigating the intense demands of royalty. The difference is, Charlotte isn't just navigating it, she's noticing everything. Observers close to the family have long said she possesses quiet strength, a seriousness in her gaze that suggests she's wise beyond her years. But wisdom can come at a cost, especially when it means seeing behind the polished smiles and scripted appearances. Over time, Charlotte has come to understand the subtle hierarchies within the family, the carefully crafted public images, and the unspoken expectations that define their lives. And while her brothers, especially little Louis, are largely shielded from the deeper tensions, Charlotte isn't. Unlike George, who bears the pressure of succession, or Louis, who is still growing into his role, Charlotte occupies a space that is both visible and vulnerable. She's not just the princess, she's the daughter, the sister, the silent observer in the background of every royal photo. And it is in that silence that her awareness has grown. What many forget is that children feel the tension that adults think they hide. In Charlotte's case, she didn't need to hear full conversations to understand what was happening. The tone shifts subtly during family dinners. The looks exchanged when certain names are mentioned. The shift in energy when Camilla enters the room. Charlotte noticed it all. She watched how her mother, Princess Catherine, would sometimes lower her eyes instead of responding. She saw her father, Prince William, retreat emotionally after certain phone calls, and she felt deep in her spirit that something unspoken was unraveling behind palace walls. The burden of knowing but being unable to speak became its silent prison. Charlotte isn't the kind of child who would throw a tantrum or demand attention. She internalizes, she observes, and most dangerously, she understands. The more she witnessed, the more she felt pulled between protecting her family and honoring what she knew to be true. That inner conflict grew with every passing day, every cold glance, every forced smile, and eventually, it became too much. The pressure to maintain the image, the pressure to smile even when her instincts screamed that something was wrong, the pressure to be royal, but also to be real. All of it collided in her young heart, and even a 10-year-old has a limit. This is not just about Charlotte's position, it's about the cost of silence, the kind of silence that stretches across generations, wrapped in protocol and duty. Charlotte may be young, but she is, after all, her mother's daughter, and her mother is known for her grace under fire. But there comes a point when even the most composed voices must speak, and Charlotte was about to do just that. So the question becomes, what happens when a child sees too much and carries too much? When does the truth become too heavy for small shoulders to bear? What happens when the quietest member of the royal family finally speaks? The answer begins with a whisper, and it ends with the words, "I can't take this any longer." When silence becomes suffocating. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, like a shadow that lingers just out of reach. At first it was subtle, a strange look exchanged between adults, a whispered conversation Charlotte wasn't supposed to hear, or an awkward silence when she entered the room. But over time, those moments began to form a pattern, a puzzle only someone truly observant could piece together, and Princess Charlotte, for all her youth, was quietly assembling the truth long before anyone realized. It started with overheard fragments. Charlotte had been reading in the corner of her mother's sitting room when she heard a hushed conversation drift in from the hallway. It was about her father, about William, and something to do with readiness. "Still too emotionally reactive," one voice said. Another answered more softly, "He may never be what the firm needs." The tone was clinical, detached, but what struck Charlotte was not just the words, it was the coolness with which they were spoken. Later, she would come to recognize that voice as Camilla's. At first, she tried to dismiss it. Maybe it wasn't what she thought. Maybe she had misunderstood. But then came the dinner parties, gatherings where formality ruled, but warmth was noticeably absent. Charlotte began to pick up on Camilla's dismissals. They weren't overt, but they were constant. She would compliment George but ignore Charlotte's achievements. She'd place a guiding hand on Louis's shoulder but act as if Charlotte wasn't standing right next to him. To an outsider, these were nothing, but to a child searching for consistency, they were everything. More than once, Charlotte saw her mother exchange uncomfortable glances with William when Camilla spoke. It was in those glances that Charlotte found confirmation. She wasn't imagining it. Something was off. Something was being hidden. But the deeper she understood, the harder it became to carry the weight alone. Charlotte is a deeply loyal child, loyal to her family, loyal to her role, but she is also deeply intuitive. That's where the struggle began. The pressure to pretend everything was fine warred against her desire to protect those she loved. And as days passed, the effort to maintain the performance began to take its toll. The pressure wasn't just emotional, it was physical. Charlotte began having difficulty sleeping. Her teachers noticed she was more withdrawn at times. Catherine, always attuned to her daughter's moods, tried to coax the truth out of her gently, but Charlotte didn't want to worry her mother, not yet. She believed that she could handle it, that somehow, if she just kept holding on, things would fix themselves. But children, even royal ones, are not meant to carry adult-sized burdens. And Charlotte, though strong, was still just a 10-year-old trying to understand the complicated dynamics of a royal household built on tradition, secrecy, and carefully managed appearances. The breaking point came during a quiet evening at home. William had just returned from an engagement. Catherine was helping Louis with a school project, and Charlotte was seated at the kitchen table sketching absent-mindedly. A family program played in the background. Then the phone rang. William answered, his tone cordial but reserved. Charlotte looked up when she heard the name, Camilla. She watched her father's face change, his jaw tighten. His responses were short, polite, practiced. But when the call ended, he didn't say a word. He simply sat down at the table staring blankly ahead. Catherine noticed too. She quietly put down the scissors she'd been using and joined him. Charlotte couldn't take her eyes off them. In that moment, everything she had felt, the confusion, the sadness, the fear, the anger, all of it came rising to the surface, and with trembling lips, she spoke the words she'd been holding back for weeks. "I can't keep this secret any longer." The room froze. Louis was too young to understand, but he stopped what he was doing. Catherine looked up, alarmed. William turned to his daughter, eyes wide. Charlotte stood up. Her fists were clenched, but her voice didn't shake. "I know something's wrong. I hear what people say when they think I'm not listening. I see how she looks at you, Daddy. I see how she treats Mummy. Everyone pretends like it's fine, but it's not. and I don't want to keep pretending. It wasn't an outburst. It was a release. The quiet confession of a child who had reached her emotional threshold. She wasn't accusing anyone. She wasn't trying to stir drama. She was simply stating what she knew to be true. Catherine rushed to her, wrapping her arms around her daughter as William stood, clearly shaken. They didn't ask how she knew. They didn't try to dismiss it, because deep down they knew she was right, and they were stunned that she had carried it all this time without saying a word. What followed in that kitchen was a moment of reckoning, a moment when the veil of royal perfection was finally torn, and the truth, raw and painful, stood in its place. For Charlotte, it was a moment of freedom. For William and Catherine, it was a moment of awakening. What they didn't yet know was just how much their daughter had seen, and how deeply it would change the family forever. The truth explodes. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind of night when nothing in particular was supposed to happen. The Wales family had retreated to their private quarters after a full day of public engagements and school routines. Dinner had come and gone. Louis had fallen asleep, curled up with a book, and George was upstairs revising for a test. In the warm glow of the kitchen, Charlotte was drawing again, an old habit that helped her think. But this time, her drawing wasn't filled with castles or ponies or forests. It was a swirl of red and black, angry scribbles wrapped around a single word she kept rewriting. Enough. When she finally spoke, it wasn't planned. She hadn't rehearsed it in her head. The words just came, quietly, painfully, honestly. I can't take this any longer. William froze mid-sentence. Catherine turned toward her daughter, her face already folding with concern. Silence followed. But it wasn't the silence of confusion. It was the stunned quiet that comes when a truth finally finds its voice. Charlotte rose from her chair. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set. She looked directly at her father. You think I don't see things, but I do. I've heard her say things about you, Daddy, about how you're too soft. I've seen how she looks at Mummy like she doesn't belong, like she's just there. William's hands tightened on the edge of the table, but he said nothing. Catherine gently placed her hand on Charlotte's arm, urging her to continue if she was ready. Charlotte's voice trembled now, but not with fear, with release. She says things when she thinks no one hears. I heard her last Christmas tell someone you weren't strong enough to be king, that you're still your mother's son, and that's not what the monarchy needs. Her eyes flickered with hurt. She said it like it was shameful. It was like dropping a match into a room soaked in silence. The effect was instant. William exhaled sharply and stood up, pacing toward the window. Catherine pulled Charlotte close, her arms tightening protectively around her daughter. There were tears now, soft, unspoken ones, as Charlotte continued. I didn't want to say anything, I really didn't. I thought maybe I misunderstood, but it keeps happening. And no one says anything. Everyone just smiles and acts like everything's fine. But it's not. It's not fine. And it makes me feel like I have to pretend too. William turned back toward them, his face unreadable. But behind his eyes, something had changed. This wasn't just about Camilla anymore. This was about his daughter carrying something she never should have had to bear. What else did you hear, sweetheart? He asked gently. Charlotte hesitated. She doesn't like us. Not really. She says we're too modern, that we've let Diana's influence linger too long, that it's time to move on. But how can she say that when you're her son? Catherine's hand went to her mouth, but not quickly enough to hide the sharp gasp that escaped. William's expression darkened, not with rage, but with the heartbreak of a son hearing his mother's legacy dismissed, and through the ears of his child, no less. Charlotte's last words were the hardest. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to cause trouble, but it's been eating me up. I thought if I stayed quiet it would go away, but it's getting worse, and I can't carry it anymore. William walked over and knelt in front of his daughter. He looked her in the eyes, steady and full of emotion. You should never have had to carry that, Lottie, not for a single day. His voice cracked, but his message was clear. He wrapped his arms around her and held her tightly. Thank you for telling us. You were brave, braver than most adults would be. Catherine joined them, her face pressed to Charlotte's hair. At that moment, they weren't royals, they weren't public figures, they were just a mother, a father, and a daughter, caught in a storm they hadn't seen coming, holding on to one another for dear life. The confession opened the floodgates for more. Over the next hour, Charlotte described not just the things she heard, but the way they made her feel. the growing discomfort at family events, the way she started dreading holidays at Sandringham. She noticed other adults glancing at her with pity. Every word peeled back another layer of what had become a quiet crisis in the Wales household. William and Catherine listened, heartbroken and angry, not at their daughter, but at the reality she had been forced to live in silence, a reality shaped by old grudges and quiet criticisms, spoken in private but absorbed by a child. They didn't try to explain it away. They didn't downplay her experience. They sat with her truth. They wept with her. And then slowly they began the process of doing what parents must do, protecting their child no matter what the cost. That night didn't end with royal protocol or carefully worded statements. It ended with lights turned low, arms wrapped tight, and the sound of a family choosing truth over silence. But even then, one question hung in the air like a storm cloud refusing to pass. If Charlotte heard all of this, what else has she seen? And how much more damage has already been done? The princess who sees everything. What Charlotte shared that night was just the surface, a single ripple in a deeper, more complicated current, because what no one expected, what not even William or Catherine fully grasped until that moment, was just how much their daughter had absorbed in silence. Behind her practiced smile and well-behaved manners was a child who had been quietly stitching together a truth, piece by piece. Charlotte had seen things most children her age would never notice and certainly wouldn't understand. But she did, not just because of her royal environment, but because of the kind of girl she is. She has her mother's quiet discernment, her father's emotional depth, and whether the palace wants to admit it or not, her grandmother's defiant clarity. She doesn't need to be told something's wrong. She senses it, and what she sensed was a contradiction, a public performance of unity, and a private undercurrent of tension. Over time, she began to see the disconnect between what was said and what was meant, the smiles that didn't reach the eyes, the praise that felt performative, the way some conversations stopped as soon as she walked into the room. No one told her directly, but the clues were all there, and Charlotte had become fluent in decoding adult silence. The most painful revelation she shared was about Queen Camilla, not the version the public sees at charity galas, but the one Charlotte observed in intimate family settings. Camilla's treatment of Catherine was never openly cruel, but it was quietly dismissive. Over and over again, Charlotte saw her mother's presence minimized, ideas ignored, gestures overlooked. When Catherine would share something thoughtful, Camilla would change the subject. When Charlotte spoke with enthusiasm about something she'd done with her mom, Camilla's response was a brief smile and a look that drifted elsewhere. To Charlotte, it became clear there was no warmth there, no genuine connection, and while others in the family may have grown used to it or chosen to look past it, Charlotte could not. Her loyalty to her parents, and especially to her mother, burned too fiercely. But the weight she carried wasn't just about observation, it was about powerlessness. She saw her father's strained expressions after conversations with his stepmother. She heard muffled arguments behind closed doors. She watched as Catherine hid her discomfort behind graceful nods and soft smiles. And perhaps the most difficult part for Charlotte was knowing that none of it could be spoken aloud. That silence was expected. Speaking up was somehow perceived as a betrayal of decorum. That night in the kitchen, as her confession poured out, William and Catherine began to realize just how deep the damage ran. Their daughter wasn't just reacting to one comment or one event. She had lived in an emotional climate that had grown increasingly cold. She had watched the warmth between her parents flicker under the weight of tension from outside forces, and in her innocence, she believed it was her job to bear it. The truth was, Charlotte didn't speak out of rebellion. She spoke out of love. She wanted to protect her parents, she wanted to shield her brothers, and above all, she wanted peace in a household where peace had been quietly eroding. What she knew wasn't just gossip or hearsay, it was the unspoken dynamics that every child senses when something isn't right in a home. Except this wasn't just a home, it was a palace. And the unspoken things had consequences far beyond their family. The hardest truth to face? Charlotte had been right all along. And now that she had spoken, there was no going back. When a child's truth shakes the crown. What happened in the Wales kitchen that evening didn't stay within its walls. It couldn't. The moment Charlotte confessed what she'd seen and felt, it set off a ripple through the heart of the royal household, a quiet but powerful tremor that began to shift everything. William was the first to respond. In the hours following Charlotte's confession, something in him shifted. the composed heir who had always strived to maintain a balance between tradition and progress, suddenly stepped into the shoes of a father first. He canceled engagements the next morning without offering any explanation to his aides. Catherine remained close to Charlotte's side, walking her through every emotion, not brushing past her words or downplaying her courage. They weren't just comforting their daughter, they were making a decision, a silent but serious one, that the emotional safety of their children came before royal optics. Within days, the palace began to feel the effects. Staff noticed the subtle change in atmosphere. Meetings involving Camilla and the Waleses became strained. Briefings were altered. Even appearances were reconsidered. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn. Charlotte's words had created a reckoning none of them could avoid. The queen consort, for her part, seemed rattled. Although there was no official confrontation, insiders noted that her usual confidence seemed to have been tempered. Her conversations with Catherine became colder, more clipped. She began to defer public appearances that involved the children. It was clear she sensed the shift, even if no one named it aloud. But the deepest impact was within the family itself. William and Catherine became more intentional about shielding their children from unnecessary exposure. Charlotte, once expected to smile dutifully beside her elders, was given space to rest, reflect, and simply be a child again. No press, no forced appearances, just healing. George, though older, was still surprised when Charlotte shared parts of her confession with him. He hadn't noticed what she had, not in the same way, but hearing her speak permitted him to voice his discomforts and observations. It brought the siblings closer, and for the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt understood by someone her age. The royal institution, of course, moved to contain things. Press briefings were tight-lipped. Any whispers of family tension were met with cool denials. But behind palace doors, damage control had already begun. Meetings were held, boundaries were discussed, and while no one issued a formal statement, everyone involved knew a line had been crossed, and it was a child who made them see it. The confession had done more than just unveil the truth. It had exposed how deeply the adults around Charlotte had underestimated her insight, and in doing so, it forced the monarchy to face what it had always struggled with: real emotion, raw honesty, and the voices of the next generation refusing to be silent. A new kind of royal strength. In the days that followed Charlotte's confession, something unexpected happened. Not within the walls of the palace, but within the heart of the young princess herself. A quiet strength began to emerge. It wasn't loud or defiant, it wasn't performative, it was the kind of strength that comes from telling the truth and surviving what follows. For the first time, Charlotte felt seen, not as the perfect middle child, the elegant royal in photographs, or the girl expected to follow the script, but as herself. Her parents treated her differently now, not with excessive caution, but with a new layer of respect. They no longer tried to protect her from the truth. They let her stand in it, with them, hand in hand. They didn't just see her as their daughter, they saw her as the girl who dared to say what no one else would. Catherine, who had carried her burdens with grace for years, told her one evening, "Your grandmother, Princess Diana, once stood alone against a tide of silence. You did something very brave, Charlotte. You reminded us that truth doesn't wait for age." Those words stuck with Charlotte. Diana had been a distant figure to her, a beautiful, tragic story told in whispers. But now she felt her grandmother's legacy in her bones. Not the glamour, not the crown, but the fire, the conviction, the instinct to protect what matters, no matter the cost. Charlotte's courage didn't come without consequences. She understood that speaking up had shifted relationships, unsettled dynamics, and possibly even created tension that might never be fully mended. But she also understood something deeper. Silence would have cost even more. She had broken the invisible rule, don't speak what hurts. And in doing so, she rewrote something inside the family, maybe even inside the monarchy itself. She had shown that strength isn't always found in titles or traditions. Sometimes it lives in the quiet voice of a child who refuses to pretend. And now, as Charlotte stood a little taller in her skin, one thing had become clear. She would never again apologize for seeing the truth, and she would never again carry it alone. The future of the monarchy. Princess Charlotte's quiet confession may have lasted only a few moments, but its impact will be felt for years to come. In saying, "I can't take this any longer," she didn't just unburden her heart, She pulled back the curtain on an emotional truth the royal family had long avoided. Her courage disrupted more than just family dynamics. It challenged the unwritten rules that silence discomfort to preserve appearances. This wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a drama. It was a child standing up for what she saw, what she felt, and what she could no longer carry alone. And in doing so, she reminded her parents, and perhaps the entire nation, that the next generation of royals may not be willing to live behind polished smiles and carefully worded scripts. Charlotte's strength is not in defiance, but in clarity. She spoke not to wound, but to protect, not to shame, but to heal. William and Catherine now find themselves facing more than just the responsibilities of royalty. They're navigating parenthood in a palace that still struggles to hold space for honesty. But thanks to their daughter's bravery, they've been given a chance to choose differently, to raise a family not built on pretense, but anchored in truth. As for Charlotte, her moment of honesty has set her apart. She is her grandmother's echo and her mother's strength. She is the future of a monarchy, slowly learning to listen, not just lead. And though she's only 10, she has already shown what it means to carry a crown of conscience. The monarchy may continue to evolve, but one thing is now certain. The era of silent suffering is over, and it was a child, poised, thoughtful, and impossibly brave, who ended it with 4 simple words. What do you think about Charlotte's confession, and what it reveals about life behind palace walls? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more royal revelations. This is just the beginning.